In honor of International Women's Day, and as I prepare a longer video on Plato, I'd like to talk about a very special lady today. The early superstar of photography. A woman who broke all barriers. A woman who ate and slayed, as they say. My god. Oh my god. The Countess of Castiglione. Virginia Elisabetta Luisa Carlotta Antonietta Teresa Maria Oldoini Rapalini was born in 1837 in Florence and had a very typical early life for a noblewoman. Her father completely ignored her and then married her off to a man who was 12 years older than her at the age of 17. This man just so happened to be the Count of Castiglione. This was clearly a political marriage. For most minor nobility at that time, you tried to get your sons into positions of influence as soon as possible, usually in the military or in the government, and your daughters would mostly be used for alliances. The marriage between the Countess and the Count produced a son, little Giorgio, a very cute little feller that we'll have a look at in just a moment. But other than their son and her new title of Countess, this marriage produced pretty much nothing, except a really interesting personal scandal that I'll explain shortly. What is much more important for the story of the Countess is the character of her cousin, Camillo Paolo Filippo Giulio Benzo, the Count of Cavour in short. Whomst is this guy? He's only the first ever Prime Minister of Italy. You see, during the Countess's lifetime, there was a great socio-political movement on everyone's minds. The Unification of Italy. Italy wasn't always this great unified boot that we know it as today. It was, of course, very unified indeed under the Roman Empire, but with the fall of Rome in 476, what we now know as Italy fragmented into many different city-states and other forms of what I guess we would most generally call polities. What's quite interesting here is that the Italian peninsula was generally thought of as one single geographical Italy by the declining Roman Empire. But after its fall, the concept of Italy's geographical unity faded away a little bit and was replaced by ethnic and political divisions as the primary ideas. You have all these warring city-states and smaller kingdoms, and all these nearby empires and bigger states claiming various properties all the time. And then only in the 11th century, the cultural idea of Italy slowly came creeping back due to linguistic resurgences and universities.
Let's leave it at that.
So as we fly through time, we see a very natural geopolitical process take place. City-states keep each other on their toes by warring with each other. There is a bunch of scheming and diplomacy and whatever else, all that good stuff that we really love on this channel. And eventually the ones that gain the edge more often end up growing. And so we end up narrowing down from a bunch of sovereign territories to the main big boys that somehow manage to survive through everything. Or in some cases, some smaller places would unify together and rename themselves as something else and become bigger that way. Whichever way that process looks, the point is that we arrive to the time of the Countess. And there we have the Papal States. This is a conglomeration of territories ruled by the Catholic Pope. Then we have several kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Sardinia, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and also the Italian kingdoms controlled by the Austrian Empire. There's a handful of duchies, there's a handful of republics, and in the aforementioned Kingdom of Sardinia, we find Victor Emmanuel II. To cut a long story short, because it is a very long story indeed, King Victor Emmanuel, with the great influential help of the Count of Cavour, the Countess's cousin, annexed all these various states and unified the peninsula into the Kingdom of Italy. And from that point on, Italy stayed more or less the same as we know it today. And so the question on everyone's mind:
how does the Countess fit into all of this?
Well, to understand her role here, we must first mention that there was a very important character in the whole Italian unification story, and this character is France. More specifically, the nephew of the great Napoleon. You see, I have a cute little statue of him here.
Do you like this?
His nephew, Napoleon III. As we all know, common enemies make for a great lubricant in geopolitical relationships, and the common enemy in this case was the Austrian Empire. The position of France was very simple.
We don't like the Austrian Empire. And we know that the Austrian Empire would really like to retain its holdings in Italy. For it to retain its holdings, it must very naturally oppose the unification of Italy. Therefore, seeing that Italy isn't much of a threat for us at all in its current state, let us help those fellers out and unify them so as to weaken the position of the Austrian Empire down there.
And so, with this in mind, the Italian men of power who want to unify their lands, of course, would try their best to foster this relationship with France. And this is why we see the Count of Cavour traveling to Paris in order to meet and greet, to improve relations and display intentions of friendship. And of course,
If this is possible,
then why not bring a charming, beautiful lady with you to help you be more convincing? And so, the two cousins set off together to Paris. The Count of Cavour informed his cousin that her explicit goal for the journey is to plead their cause as much as she can with Napoleon III. And, she pleaded it well, because she quite quickly became his mistress. Very naturally, by having obtained such an intimate position with one of the great European royals, this opened up a much bigger area for her to operate in, and she quickly became acquainted with many royals, women and men of influence, of power, many of whom she took as lovers. The entire French court was smitten by her, and then the entire European royal court was also very smitten by her indeed. This beautiful, young, charismatic lady of great fashion taste. There is a story that the wife of an Austrian ambassador said that she was petrified before the miracle of her beauty. And even though the affair with Napoleon III only lasted a couple years, her reputation as a beautiful, charming, sensational fixture in Parisian high society remained forever. A woman of divine beauty, an Italian blessing for the French. What did this result in? Certainly, first of all, in a very lavish, exquisite lifestyle. Good for her. But it also seems to have played a great hand for not only the unification of Italy, but also the saving of Paris from the Prussian occupation of France. In the former, even though their affair had ended at that point, Napoleon III recognized the newly formed Kingdom of Italy very gladly. And so this immediately gave it a fair deal of international legitimacy as a newly formed kingdom. Had she not pushed this cause on him, we could mayhaps say that the Italian legitimacy question would have been a bit more difficult to sort out. Whenever a new state or kingdom forms, it is very important that the biggest players on the scene recognize the state and grant it legitimacy in the eyes of all the other players. This is not only important in terms of external affairs, basically making sure that you are respected as the newest participant there, but also for the population of the land itself. In order for a state to feel fully legitimate, it not only needs mythology to justify how it came to be, or a long history that clearly displays the fact that this state was always there, just never formed properly. And to this mix, you need international recognition, so that as a citizen of this state, you can walk around comfortably and freely knowing that other countries recognize you as a member of the state. You are a legitimate citizen both internally and externally. Now, as for the latter, the saving of Paris, the Countess was allegedly summoned for a secret meeting with her longtime acquaintance Otto von Bismarck after the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War. This is a very important turning point for the European continent, and I am sure you know who Otto von Bismarck is. And in this meeting, she somehow managed to explain to him that occupying Paris went against his German interests. And so, Paris was left unoccupied. We obviously have to say here that finding out just how much of an influence she was in this decision is impossible. But I like to think that at least partially this is an achievement of hers. Now, everything we said up until this point is very fine and dandy. She was clearly a very impressive individual who took an interesting approach to the European aristocratic networking sphere, and her approach seems to have been quite successful indeed. However, where I personally think her true achievements lie, and why I'm presenting her today for you, is in the artistic field. You see, the Countess was not only a royal, but she was also a person of immense artistic taste. And how did she manifest this taste? Through photography. When we think of photography in the 19th century, we think of boring portraits, people who look half dead on their images, very damaged and colorless pictures of buildings that don't exist anymore, the richest of the rich who could afford to take a couple portraits of their family but weren't at all creative with it. And of course, on top of all of this, there is a very definite sense of shyness. There were very strict norms for what was allowed to be shown to the public through a photograph. Men had to look very serious and militaristic, while women had to wear their corsets, have their hair tied up, ankles, shoulders, and arms hidden. But do you know what the Countess said to all of this? She hit them with a very pleasantly, "Fuck off, screw your conventions, I'll show my ankles if I want to." So as the young countess became a staple of French imperial court life, she sat for photographs with the imperial photographers as you normally would. But instead of just taking the occasional photo and forgetting about it, it seems that this experience ignited in her a hunger for the photographic medium. Over the next 40 years of her life, she pretty much bankrupted herself as she became what would now be called a director of photography. Keep in mind, she not only had access to her personal fortune, but she also had access to the fortune of the man that she was supposedly married to, even though she was openly cheating on him with the Emperor of France. The Countess hired a certain photographer and directed him to make over 700 photographs over this 40-year period. Once again, this was a very expensive and time-occupying hobby. She would choose the set, she would choose her outfits, her props, how the photos would be developed, and so on. And these photographs were nothing short of spectacular. And so for the rest of this video, I'd like to present you with a selection of her very best photographs with some very light commentary. While we look at them, never forget that these come from the 19th century, a time when even looking at someone slightly erotically would be scandalous in a public setting. What may seem like normal and creative photographs today were a highly controversial matter some 170 years ago. Let us enjoy some photographic images. Wow! I am the most annoying person I've ever met, and I have to spend 24/7 with myself.
Please help me.
Let us begin with one of the most famous photos. As you can see on the screen, we've got the full package here. Exposed shoulder, exposed arm, messy hair, messy accessories, and in the very center of the image, the Countess is framing her eye, looking back into the camera through a lens-shaped hole. When viewing this photograph, what springs to mind immediately is that she is framing our observation of her as a photographic experience as well. Her eye is mimicking the camera in front of her, and she isolates her eye by covering half of her face. The eye is clearly where she wants us to look, perhaps because her eyes are the first charming impression you get of her. They were said to oscillate between a piercing violet, blue, and green, which would obviously be even more accentuated by her very pale skin. Us observing her is just as much a photographable experience as is her own act of posing for a photograph. We are her subject, enamored by her beauty, I guess we could say. And through this photo, she is capturing anyone caught in that moment of looking at her
forever.
What a creative brain. Now our second image is also one of her most popular ones. As you see here, she is posing in the so-called Queen of Hearts outfit. And as we said, she was indeed a queen of many hearts. What we see here, first of all, is that she is not wearing a corset, something very scandalous for the times. And on top of this, the top part of her bosom area is a see-through gauze. I'm sure that many men enjoyed the sight at the royal dinner parties indeed. There are some other things to take note of here though. She is showing her foot and ankle, which today means absolutely nothing, but once again, remember the times. This was not appropriate at all. Her hair is also down, something that would be associated with a bit of a primal nature, a very erotic, classic presentation. Perhaps this makes you think of ancient myths, like that of Artemis when Actaeon spots her bathing. In such a story, the hair of Artemis and the nymphs would obviously be down, and Actaeon is then of course punished severely for stumbling on this. The real fascinating detail of this outfit, however, is this heart that you can observe below her hips. Its placement is on the nether regions, so to speak. The wife of Napoleon III noticed this as well, and allegedly commented on the placement being very inappropriate and far too low. Knowing what we know about the Countess, we can easily assume that this was intentional. For all the lovers that she had, perhaps their heart was to be found down there and not up here. But who knows? The third image here doesn't have much in terms of symbolism. I chose it to show you just how grand her outfits were for these photographs. And also we can look at her son, the little Italian boy Giorgio that we mentioned at the start. He appears to be a prop here, and this is the case for many of her photographs. There are very few where he plays a central role, and instead he is usually present somewhere on the side, getting no attention from the Countess. She looks at the camera, showing off her grand outfit and style, and then the boy next to her is an extension of this taste. He is essentially an accessory. Now the fourth image here is probably my favorite, but it needs a little backstory first. As we said, The Countess did get married at 17, but this marriage fell apart pretty much immediately because she began her affair with Napoleon III. This was, of course, public information, and so her husband separated from her and cut ties as much as possible because she was also spending his monies while she was abroad. By this point, they already had their child, the little Italian boy Giorgio, and so they separated, and as you saw with the previous image, Countess took little Giorgio with her to France and he stayed with her mostly. This was until her husband told her that he's heard enough rumors about her lifestyle and wants the kid back in Italy in order to raise him properly and probably put him in a military school and all this typical stuff. As a response to this, the Countess sent him this image. Title: The Vengeance. Before we comment on the main detail here, just take a second to appreciate the look on her face, and generally how heavy the atmosphere of the photograph is. No fun and games here, but instead we have all of these shades of red and gold, quite powerful and aggressive colors. And now for the main event, the knife in her hand. What means? Very clearly,
Leave me and my son alone or I will kill you.
this fits in perfectly with the red color of the dress, symbolizing blood and anger, perhaps. What a powerful thing to send to someone. Now, another image of creative interest. The mirror trick. Nothing controversial about this image. What we have here is the display of a creatively flexible mind. Not every person would think to look away from the camera and use a mirror to look back into it, but the Countess did think of it. And what results from this is a photo with a lot of weight and very good focus on the eyes once again. You have no choice but to look in the mirror first, and hence you are making direct eye contact with her immediately. And therefore she's pretty much immediately in control here the same way she is in all her relationships. I'm really overanalyzing these pictures, huh? The following picture is probably one of her most dangerous and subversive ones. I present you the legs. In order to not waste any of your time, I will get it straight out of the way. Feet joke number 1. Feet joke number 2. Feet joke number 3. Feet. And then feet joke number 4 to tie it all up and get a good laugh. Anyway, what's interesting about this photo and quite a few others of a similar style that she took is that she didn't show her face in them. There is one where her face is purposefully blurred, but otherwise it's never in the frame at all. However, out of the many men and women who were well acquainted with her body due to her revealing outfits and some of the other stuff they got up to, anybody who saw these images and knew that she took photographs relentlessly would know that these are her legs and feet. This fact makes the whole thing of showing her legs on photographs that much more provocative. People know that she's doing it, and she knows that people know personally. And yet she just carries on, pushing the limits even though the people she knows personally will frown upon her activity. For the lovers of Shakespeare and his Hamlet specifically, I've got a little treat for you here as well. The Countess as Ophelia. I quite like this picture from a directorial perspective. It is assembled perfectly in what it is trying to convey. Basically, the Countess looks disheveled and a little bit crazy here, and perhaps even dead by this point, which is of course the same fate that befell Ophelia. This photograph is almost like a modern reinterpretation of Ophelia's moment of death. Instead of drowning in a body of water the way they did in medieval times, the Countess is in a regular looking room with a bedsheet instead of water. If Ophelia lived in our times, this is probably how she would have died from her insanity, just lounging about in her living room, instead of this beautiful medieval river death which the average European by that time wouldn't really be too familiar with, versus a death in the crowded city. Now as the Countess gets older, and as she feels her beauty begin to fade, and thus her visual power and influence weaken, we begin seeing more and more images in this style. The nun. The woman who wishes to now run from the real world and find sanctuary somewhere far away from the eyes of the young men and women. She covers herself. She looks more and more serious, angry, distraught, maybe even disappointed with the outside world or how life is treating her. And unfortunately, her later life in Paris, where she retired, did very much end up being quite dark, miserable, and brooding. As she got older, and her mental well-being declined, and she perceived what she thought to be a decline of her physical aspect, her apartment in the heart of Paris essentially turned into a large coffin or some sort of monastic cave. Everything was painted black. There was never any natural natural light allowed into the home, and all of the mirrors were forbidden. This made sure that she never caught a glimpse of herself declining, and the only time she would see herself is in the few photos that she took. She took far less pictures at this point, and the ones she did take in her very last few years were nothing remarkable at all. They say this is because she was really mentally unstable at this point and did not have the mental get-together to properly direct the photography set. At this point, she only left the house at night. She never got any sunlight. She most probably wasn't feeding herself very well. She barely socialized with anyone. Reminds me of myself. And so, at the age of 62, in deep mental anguish over her fading beauty and age, the Countess passed away on November 28th, 1899. What a personality. I hope that she is resting peacefully, and I'm happy that her young beauty has been captured forever in the photographs. In this way, she gets to live on at her best forever. It seems that time and time again, the most creative individuals die alone and in absolute torment. Very sad indeed. Now, I urge you to spend some time looking at the vast amount of photographs that we have of the Countess, and always keep in mind that this was a person of great significance for the European royalty, and not just some lady with a vision and money to spend. I don't want to reach here, but maybe we could say that we can't really eliminate her from the long chain of world events. Even if her influence was not great, it may have been at least a little bit decisive in some historical moments. Who knows? I hope that you enjoyed this video. This was a bit experimental of me. I am not a big photography guy, but the Countess has smitten my heart, as they say. I apologize for the shorter video, but I am very busy preparing our next class of Brainrot University. But if you want to talk about the Countess with me and some friends, come join me in my great Discord if you haven't already. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Ciao.